So it is now my pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Esther Duflo, whose talk today is titled Social Science Research and the Fight Against Poverty. Dr. Duflo is an Abdul Latif Jameel Professor of Poverty Alleviation and Development Economics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She is director of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab. Her research focuses on microeconomic issues in developing countries, including household behavior, education, access to finance, health, and policy evaluation. Professor Duflo has received numerous academic honors and prizes, and they're listed in the materials that were provided to you, so I'm not going to go through all of that. Dr. Duflo is a research associate for the National Bureau of Economic Research, serves on the board of the Bureau for Research and Economic Analysis and Development. She is a member of the President's Global Development Council. She serves as a founding editor of the American Economic Journal Applied Genetics. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Duflo join us at this conference, and we look so forward to hearing your talk. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Duflo to the podium.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I noticed on the picture that was here that I was about 6 months pregnant with my first child, and I look a bit tired, and now I'm 6 months pregnant with my second child, and I still look a little bit tired. So it's the same person. I'm quite pleased to be here. I'm a researcher who grappled with human subject issues almost every day. I'm also a member of an IRB, and in this way I grapple with other people's ethics problem also. And I certainly feel like I could do with some guidance pretty frequently. So I'm very glad to know that of the work that this organization is doing, and to play a tiny part of it. Let me give you a bit of background on what I do, because I know that a lot of you are not really in social science research. So I work on the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, which I co-funded along with colleagues at MIT, is a network of researchers that does randomized evaluation of anti-poverty programs. Why do we do that? We do that because the motivation for this work when it got started is the idea that in the world of the fight against poverty, or against global poverty worldwide, the discourse is very polarized and very ideological. So, in particular, viewed from this part, it often becomes the discourse about the fight against poverty and about development often becomes a discourse about aid, even though aid is really, foreign aid is such a small part of this. And then you have this very strong position. So for example, you have Jeff Sachs on the one hand saying that foreign aid is a solution to the problem, and the only ethical thing to do is to spend a lot of it, and we know what to do. On the other hand, you have William Easterly, which argues that actually that aid is bad rather than good, so that the only ethical thing to do would be to stop it immediately. And there is very little way to adjudicate between these claims, but these are very forceful claims. Both of these people are academics. Jeff Sachs is at Columbia, and William is at Easterly is at NYU. And they really respond to a demand for a discourse on poverty, which is both scientifically legitimate and forceful in its conclusion. So that's why you get these people who are speaking from an academic podium with this very strong conclusion. And typically the way these conclusions are backed are from cross-country comparisons. So you're taking the few hundred countries around the world and comparing their experiences. So you say, well, on the one hand, countries which have a lot of malaria are poorer than other countries, so that must mean that malaria is bad. So if we could fight against malaria effectively, these countries would become so much richer. And then on the other hand, you have, oh, we gave so much money got spent in Africa, and Africa is still poor, so that must mean that aid didn't work. So of course, neither of these claims is particularly useful because separating cause and effect in this data set of 100 countries is very difficult. You take the malaria example, for example, the countries that have a lot of malaria, they also have all sorts of other problems. And in fact, one may argue that the reasons why they were not able to control malaria when many countries managed in the 1960s is because they have other issues of political economy, governance, etc., that will affect other dimension of health and other dimension of the economy in general. And so this is what explains that they are doing poorly, not malaria per se. And even if we found a way to get rid of malaria, we wouldn't solve the problem. The issue is you can't really solve this problem by just looking at cross-country comparison. So you could say, well, fine, whatever, we can't really solve this problem, we can think of another problem. Alternatively, you can say, well, let's maybe step back from the big questions, are we going to be able to eradicate poverty? And try to break down the problem into many much more manageable issues. So for example, instead of asking whether malaria makes country poor, we could ask whether for a particular child having been exposed to malaria in childhood has consequences during the rest of his or her life. And even more useful, maybe we could say, for a particular child having been given a bed net when they were small and therefore being at least partially protected from malaria with the tools that we have today, how much better would that child be off, how much better off would that child be for the rest of her life? Or even maybe even more concrete, we could ask, well, we all agree that bed net distribution is a good thing, but should bed net be given for free or should they be sold for some price? And if they are sold for some price, at what price? And it becomes very, first, much more actionable questions we are asking. And it has two benefits. One of them is that it has a direct link to policies that can be implemented by countries with or without aid, and aid becomes irrelevant to this point. We have switched from the aid question, which is not particularly interesting, to the policy question, what is a good policy, which is the interesting question, whoever finances the aid. And secondly, these are questions which are well-defined and therefore can be answered, which is always a good start for any research program. So there is a quote from FDR, which I really like. He speaks in 1932, so in the middle of still the height of the 1929 crisis. And he says the country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and take another, but above all, try something. So I like this quote because he's speaking in desperate times, again, desperate problems that might, in a sense, seem intractable. And he says, okay, look, we have to try something. We don't know what to do, but on the other hand, there are ideas out there. We should try. We should be open to the possibility of failure. But if it fails, we can find out, we can try the same thing, and eventually there'll be progress. And the way I see it, the fight against poverty worldwide is a response to a permanent state of crisis. And social policy needs, and often lack imagination, needs the willingness to try things out and think out of the box. Often policymakers are exactly like Sachs or Easterly that I just quoted in introduction. They want to solve the entire problem at once. They want to find the one magic bullet that is going to solve the poverty problem. That's true both in this country and in the developing world. And they also want, often maybe for electoral reasons, to say that they have the solution. They know what to do. You can't go and say, it's not a very palatable electoral program to arrive and say, well, I'm going to try this and that, and then we'll see what comes next. You have to be FDR to be able to say that. So here, social science can play a role. Social scientists being a little bit removed from the hustle and bustle of actually running things can play a role in guiding policy in what I call a process of creative experimentation. What do I mean by that? So experimentation in both sense of the term. The colloquial sense of the term, which is try things that you haven't tried before. So go and experiment, think out of the box. But the second thing is the meaning that probably in this room you're more used to, which is experiments as in scientific experiment, which is once you try something out, you have a responsibility to find out whether it was a good idea or a bad idea in the first place. And the way you do that is through a rigorous scientific investigation. So the objective of experimentation in this space is double. It's to generate research in the sense by which, the framework in which you guys operate in your committee defines research, the advancement of knowledge, but it's also to directly help policymakers, implementers, et cetera, often immediately, often the very people with whom you're working. And that creates a little bit of a tension between pure research, the way that we look at it, and between action. And that creates some little human subject conundrums that I'm going to talk about a little later in this talk. The reason why we have the two imperative of trying new things out but also rigorously evaluate it is that we often get it wrong. So I should have written social scientists, I could have written social scientists, but being an economist, I think it makes more sense to write economists. Get it wrong a lot of the time. I don't think, maybe of you think because it's a worse science than most science, or it's not a science at all. But I think mostly because, like anybody else, like an engineer or like a scientist, you need to simplify, you need to model, you need to streamline reality to be able to analyze it. Reality is too complex to be interpreted without some simplifications. And then as you do that, you are almost bound to ignore important elements. So this is like the same thing as a side effect for a drug. When you're trying to develop a drug, you focus on the part of the molecule that is going to do what you want it to do, but then there is the whole rest of the molecule that creates the side effects. So in an economic intervention, in a sense, it's the same thing. You focus on the mechanism you want to focus on, but then there is a bunch of other things that you've unleashed that you can't possibly all keep in your mind. When you think of a new machine, you are thinking of the role that the machine is supposed to play, but you might ignore the fact that in the process of that, it's likely to overheat in some other place and create some problems. So, of course, that doesn't mean we shouldn't invent new drugs. That doesn't mean we shouldn't develop new machines. That doesn't mean we shouldn't think about new economic policy or social policies. It means you have to be careful. Everybody gets it wrong. We get it wrong as researchers, but policymakers get it wrong just the same. International organizations get it wrong. Developing country governments get it wrong. Developed country governments get it wrong. So the problem is not to get it wrong. That's just the way it is. The problem is to not learn that we have gotten it wrong and to not learn why and how we can correct those mistakes. So the possibility of errors in designing new programs or policies is not a reason not to do anything, to sit in the sideline. It's a reason for being pretty humble and careful and to have careful evaluations for all policies of program, including the ones that are designed with Nobel Prize winners, economists in the background, or the ones that are designed by any persons in an NGO who knows the field very well. Neither of these people is immune to making mistakes. Both of these people are liable to have good ideas as well, and therefore we need to evaluate what they're doing. And the reasons why program evaluation is particularly needed in social policy, in particular to the fight against poverty, as against, you don't particularly need program evaluation for a new car, for example. The reason why social policy is different is that social policy comes in precisely when there is a market failure of some sort. So for example, when there is a desire for redistributing resources, or when you feel that, for example, the education level that parents would pick for their children is below what would be optimal from a society's point of view. So you've made that decision, you being a government or society makes this decision, that's a decision that's outside of the research. Once you've made that decision, the problem is if you start to build schools, to take the education example, and you make them available for free, parents will have a lot to lose for not going to those particular schools that you're offering them. And therefore, they have no option really to vote with their feet if the schools happen to be very poorly run. They can, and in some places like in India, for example, they do, where they give up on the public school system and go to private schools, even though they have to pay for the private school and the public school is free. But if you've reached that point, you've gotten wrong somewhere way down, way before. That means that if we take the schools the way they are, the schools are free, people have to go to these schools, they have to take what you're giving them. The only way to know whether the schools are run the way they should be run or whether there are better ways to run them, better ways to organize the curriculum, better ways to organize the classroom, better ways to select or reward the teachers, or whatever questions you might have about the best way of running a school system, you're not going to learn it from the response of the parents. You'll have to learn it from trying it out and comparing. That makes social policy very, very different from running a business. Where when you run a business, people have to pay for what you offer them. If it's not a good thing, they'll just go away. Therefore, there is no guarantee that the money is well spent. And to guarantee that it is well spent, first you have to make sure that it is spent as planned. That's not particularly difficult in principle. You just have to monitor, audit, etc. And then there is a question of impact evaluation, which is, if I had decided to spend the money in some other way instead, if my classes were tracked, for example, by previous achievement, or in fact all the kids are randomized, if kids are grouped by age or by something else, would that make a difference? And this is where the randomized control trials come in, because in the real world, it's very difficult usually to answer these questions because the places that organize the school system some ways are different from the places that organize it in some other way. For example, if teachers have textbook, then those same teachers may also have flip charts and computers and be more motivated or what have you. So the data that we see in the real world about some particular variation in a way of running the classroom, it's associated with all sorts of things, some of which we measure, some of which we don't measure, which makes it impossible to tease out any causality. So that's what was my initial motivation from running randomized control trials, is really to find out what works, what doesn't work, how programs should be run, and thinking there is really no substitute for that. So about 10, 15 years ago, it was, you had social experiments in the US, the negative income tax experiment, the Rand health insurance experiment, all inspired by my biomedical research and to some extent by agricultural research in fields, but almost none in development. Now it's much, much more frequent. It's been accepted really as a tool to find out what works, what doesn't work. The JPAL network, which I have the privilege to run, has about 300 ongoing or finished projects. And then all of the major international agencies have embraced randomization, at least as part of what they are doing. And you see it more in governments as well. The first generation of program evaluation randomized control trials in development were really trying to see what works. You know, should you give textbooks and flip charts and kind of very straightforward kind of programs. But today, randomization is much more used as a tool to answer questions that are motivated by theory. So it means that people are working with much more sophisticated design, where they have many, many treatments at various levels that together in one experiment, and much more control of what is happening in the field. I think this is a good development because exactly like in the biomedical world, It is the theory that is behind the experiment that provides you with the possibility to generalize from one finding to the other. And the possibility to generalize is really what justifies running an experiment in the first place. Because otherwise, if there is no benefit to be gained from the point of view of general knowledge, then should you be running an experiment? It's not that clear. So the benefits are coming from the knowledge that you generate. The knowledge that you generate requires a statement about the external validity of your experiment, which typically is based on what's the underlying theory, explicitly or implicitly. So I think it's a very good development, but that means that the field experiments where you have real people in the field that you are working with become both a tool for policy, where I think it's uncontroversial that it helps, and a tool for research, and where we have to ask ourselves all the ethical questions. They become more, I think they come more to the forefront when projects are explicitly and foremost research projects with the view of creating this more general knowledge. So I want to spend just a few minutes putting in front of you things that you probably know, and I, in a sense, should know as well. But I'm going to present them as puzzle because there are more questions than answer at this stage. Even though I realized when preparing for this talk that there are, maybe especially as a member of an IRB, I should have maybe a clearer stance on many of these issues, and I realized that I don't, and we've been kind of advancing as we go. So on the first one, I have a pretty clear stance, but I'll say it anyway. It's probably, it might be obvious in this room, I don't know. But the question we often get when people ask us about ethics, the general public, what they have in mind, what troubles them, is randomization. Many people of the lay public think that randomization itself is not ethical. And usually that comment just reflects a lack of understanding of what the status quo would be. So it's not that you're taking away things because you randomize them into a treatment versus another. You are adding something that that would not have been present in the absence of the program. And also the huge benefit of the research for this population, these very population lives, through the scale-up of the successful intervention. So I'll take one example, which is research by Michael Kramer from Harvard on deworming, which is one of the very early randomized evaluations that were done in development. He showed that he ran an experiment where we had randomization at the school level of deworming, universal deworming for all the kids in areas that are likely to be contaminated with worms. This is in Kenya, so this is places where there is a lot of sort of intestinal worms. Randomized at the school level, 100 schools were phased into the program. Sorry, 75 schools were phased into the program. First 25, then 50, then 75. So the last 25 serve as a control for the first 25 for the first years. They found that it's a hugely beneficial thing to do in that it's very, 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 very cheap. It helps kids to go to school more, and they are taller, etc. So it's tremendously cost effective. Subsequently, they followed cohort of these kids and shown that they also, several years later, earn much more wages, etc. On the basis of this research, been a movement to scale up deworming, school-based deworming, and now millions and millions of kids are dewormed. I think in the last, there's an organization, Deworm the World, that helps government set up programs, and they are of the order of like tens of millions of kids are dewormed thanks to this organization. So initially, they worked with an NGO that was going to work with about 25 schools. Because it was a research program and 25 schools would not have been enough, they worked in 100 schools. So immediately, you have more kids treated than would have been. But of course, the key thing is that because it happens to be working, that allows for universal deworming in Kenya, actually, thanks to the research to the result of the program. But probably I'm just telling you things that you know. So let me actually do raise the one issue that I think randomization can raise in developing countries for social programs is the question of equipoise. Do we know that the control group gets the best status quo? So in this case, do we know that the 50 schools that didn't get treated before, the WHO was already recommending mass deworming when possible. So in a sense, you're not giving them the standard of care at some level. Although you do give them the standard of care in this country at this time, which is to do nothing, this is not the best we think can be done. So that creates this potential issue that is purely a research issue. I think you can easily go too far, because in this case, many people were not at all convinced that universal deworming is the best way to go from a policy perspective. So the status quo would have been nothing at the level of the world. So showing that it's in fact a good thing to do and cost-effective changes what is this, or has the potential to change what is the standard of care. And therefore, we shouldn't be, like we could very, very easily throw the baby with the bathwater saying we have to, the standard should be what we think is the best, what the frontier of knowledge is at a given point in time. Because that's just totally unrealistic in terms of what is actually going on in the field and what could possibly be achieved. So I think the key underlying this problem is the fact that typically the problem is not whether something might hurt, but whether something is worth the money. So the problem with a lot of programs that we evaluate is not that they can do any bad, is that they're probably in principle good idea, but most of them are just not useful. So the problem is that you have these great ideas, and then maybe 9 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 are just not, they don't do anything. And if they don't do anything, then even though they are the best idea we have in the world, they are not such great ideas. So they need to be evaluated before we move forward. What's a bit delicate, it's a question of cost-benefit. You have tiny, tiny benefits, and then because it's not worth doing it, because we are so constrained in terms of the money that is available to do things. But that requires rethinking slightly the framework of equipoise for social science and policy research as opposed to developing new drugs. The other thing that is important to say is that there is so much uncertainty and much more than is usually acknowledged. So people will typically think that it is obvious that blah. So it is obvious that people should be getting textbooks in schools because it's much better to have textbooks than not to have textbooks. And therefore, you cannot do an experiment where you give textbooks to some kids and not to some other, because the standard should really be to have textbooks. Well, it turns out it's not at all obvious, because textbooks do nothing at all. So in a sense, it's unethical to give textbooks and not to track children by achievement, because tracking children by achievement actually helps. So I think in a lot of cases, there is so much uncertainty about what is going to work that we need to be much more open-minded and not assume that this is what the standard should be. The second thing that I want to raise quickly is the problem of the blurring of policy and research. So medical trials are tightly controlled by doctors or by a company or something, by the people who actually do the research. And that's often much less true with social science experiments. The typical example of a social experiment, especially when it's about finding out policy work as opposed to sophisticated research work, has a partner, for example, a government, a firm, an NGO, which is running a program anyway. And they agree to phase in randomly for the research. So it is undoubtedly research the moment that you phase in randomly, because the moment the researchers are convinced to phase in randomly and you want to collect data. So I think there's no, some people argue that's not even research. It doesn't fit in human subject, because they would do it anyway. But that's, the moment you set it up as a research project and you're going to collect data on people, that's research. So I have no problem on that. So that you need to have some human subject guidance, but the issue is at what level? And in particular, the question that I think needs to be asked on a case-by-case basis is whether you're responsible for the program as well, if it was going to happen anyway. So I'll give you one example, and it's an example that I was involved with. I was running the project, and I got IRB approval for it, both here and in India. The government has on the books some penalty for nurses that don't show up to work. But they don't really enforce them. They decided that they were going to start to enforce them, and we told them, why don't you evaluate first? So we have a randomized evaluation where in half the sub-centers, the nurses are now well monitored, so you can check whether it makes sense to enforce those penalties or not. That can hurt the nurses who now have to show up to work and presumably would rather not show up to work or not lose their work. What should an IRB have done? I can tell you what our IRB did, which is to say that it was fine. But where they should have, you could ask the question, they stand to lose because of the research. They would have lost anyway because the program would have been implemented. But at least if you have nothing to do with it, then it's an interesting footnote is that program actually failed miserably in that there's no point enforcing the penalties on the nurses because they have so many things to do that they can't comply with everything they have to do. So eventually the system of enforcement was undermined from within. So it was a useful thing to learn, that there's no point enforcing the system as it stands because it's not well designed. But in the meantime, some people got their salary docked. So my view on that is that it's very hard to have a general view in that you can't say, well, it's not your, you can't say, you can't say, well, since it's not your program, it's the government's work, I'm not going to even look at it. The moment you're involved, the moment you have some oversight of it, you don't have oversight of the program, but you know what it is about. The moment you're informed what it is about, you have a responsibility towards the people who are involved in the project, both the nurses and the patients. But you might not be responsible for every single details in that. And that means often that I think the decision might be more an up and down decision, so you can go there or you cannot go there, than trying to tell people, well, you can do this program, but then you need to do it in this way such that the nurses are protected, because that's often the researchers will not have that level of control, because it's not their program, it's the government's program. And at some level, who is NB or IRB that I'm part of, or MIT IRB who oversees my research to tell the government of India how they are to treat their nurses? It's kind of weird. So often the only decision you really could make is to say, look, I think you should stay away from that. And then you have to think, is it worth it to stay away from that research, given what we could possibly learn from the result? And so that's why it's always this judgment that we keep making between the potential benefit to the knowledge to be gained and a risk is even more judgment-driven than probably we like it to be. Last example that I will mention is clustered trials. Clustered trials are very common in development because often the cluster is the reasonable unit of implementation. For example, if you're going to do a classroom, like a school research, your only natural research is the school. We can't really randomize at the individual level within the school. When you introduce a new product, for example, microfinance in a market, well, your natural unit of randomization is the market. Even when it's not the only possible unit of implementation, we have to be aware of possibilities of contamination, spillovers, market effects, et cetera. So for example, in the deworming studies, it was very important to randomize at the school level because worms are very contagious. So if you randomize at the individual level, your control group is treated just as much as your treatment group. There is often also issues of political, practical feasibilities in respect of the protocol. So for example, if we're going to start a new project where we have a small incentive for parents to immunize their children. In principle, it could be randomized at the individual level. In practice, you can't have some parents arrive and you give them incentive, and some parents arrive and you don't give them incentive. It's just not going to work. It's not going to be implemented in practice. And it might even be difficult to randomize at the nurse level, because at the village level, with the same nurse having to do different things in different places, because they're going to get confused. So you might want to randomize at a higher level, where a bunch of nurses are going to be in the new system and a bunch of nurses are going to be in the old system. Finally, I think one reason why clustered trials are more common in development is that the big downside is data collection is more expensive, since you have clustering of the standard error, so you need to collect a lot of data. But collecting data is not that expensive in many settings in developing countries, so that's something that you might be willing to do. So clustered trials have a lot of ethical issues that you guys probably know more about than I do, but let me tell you what has come across for me. One is, who gives consent when consent is to be given? So for example, you go at the community level, like who is the community? Do you have a school, you could have a meetings, but not everybody's going to show up at the meeting. So that's one. The second question, who is a subject? For example, in the example that I gave about incentive for nurses to show up, in a sense, you could say, well, you're hurting the nurses by making them show up. But on the other hand, you're helping the people. So you could think of it not as a nurse-level trial, but as a clustered trial at the level of the subcenter, where the subject are the people. And then the vast majority of the subjects tends to benefit from the fact that the nurse is actually in the office. So that's kind of something to think about. Another issue is often people cannot opt out of the program once it's at the level of the school. Often they can opt out of the data collection, because you can go to them and you say, can I collect data on you now? So at least you can ask informed consent at that level. But there are even cases where they can't even do that very easily. For example, we are running with psychologists at Harvard a program on math. We are introducing math games in preschool. So it's setting in preschool in India, where it's just minding the kids. So kids do nothing typically. They just hang out, whatever. It's daycare. It's little kids, 3, 4-year-olds. And the psychologists have developed a series of math games to prepare them for formal school entry. And the way we set it up is that we said, well, we are going to have a parents' meeting where we explain what the games are about. And then if the school is willing to participate, we go ahead. The IRB actually, for the first time, asked me, what if a particular parent don't want their child to participate? And I was a bit baffled by the question at first. I was like, whatever, like how can I do it? It's either the school participates or not. Like you can't remove the kid. It would be horrible for the kid to be sitting in the side. So, okay, we agreed that if the school has agreed, the kid will have to be part of the program. And it's very little chances that it hurts them, so that was fine. But then the second interesting question is the psychologists wanted to video the classrooms. And you can't video a class, like the classroom in India is about the size of this table. So I can't video the classroom and not video all the kids. So you can't really opt out of the data collection. So there what I suggested is that if any parents don't want their kids to be in the video, then we won't video. But that's because the video is only a small part of it. If it had been critical to the data collection, then probably I would have pushed back and we could have found some other solution. But it was an interesting context. Another question that I want to ask sometimes is whether consent is needed. For example, you introduce microcredit in a village. You randomly select which village you're going to put microcredit and not others. It doesn't mean that people in the villages have to take microcredit. It's an option for them. So in some places they have the option, in some places they don't. When you're going to collect data on microcredit, you're going to ask them whether they agreed to be collected. Do you need to have consent at the level of community to open this office? So in this particular case, I've been part of microcredit evaluation. We've never asked, it didn't even occur to me till thinking about this program that we should ask the community whether it's okay to open a microfinance branch. But in a sense, you could argue that we should have asked whether it's okay to open the branch, even though people then have the option to take it or not to take it. Because you could argue that people don't understand the rules and they might get over-indebted and they might, all sorts of stuff, bad stuff might happen to them if they take up microcredit, which would not have happened if you had not opened the branch, and therefore there should have been a meeting, at least a community meeting, to agree whether or not microcredit should have been influenced. So to my knowledge, there are no very useful general principles that can be applied here. This is really on a case-by-case basis. In the case of microcredit, I think the actual potential risks of having a branch is very small. But it's, again, the same thing. You're going to, in some other cases, it might be much bigger. So in some cases, you might need individual consent before you do anything, even at the community level. That might make the research totally impractical. In some cases, you might decide to abstain from the research. In most cases, you're going to say, fine, we can proceed. So stepping back, and just as a way of conclusion, is it the case that we're running into this problem, which are kind of detailed problem, are we abandoning the goal to reduce poverty significantly one day, which is what I started with? And so obviously, given what I do, you might think I think not. And in fact, I think not. I think, on the contrary, experimenting with specific programs to address the particular issues associated with poverty is a necessary first step to try and solve the problem of poverty. The first one is to be wealthy, you need to be alive. So Keynes has this line that is overused to say that in the long run, we'll all be dead. It was his encouragement that we should focus on short-run stimulus packages because the long-run problem won't be problems if we are dead. But when we think of kids in developing countries, sometimes it's actually true. Like, we need to figure out today if they are immunized before thinking about long-term growth. The second thing is it's often a political imperative to figuring out, to really spend an effort to figure out what works. This is the rest of the Roosevelt quote that I started with. The sentence immediately after is, the millions who are in want will not stand by silently forever, while the things to satisfy their needs are within easy reach. And I think we often forget, in the desire for high growth, we often forget the key imperative of having a welfare improvements for the majority of the population in order to keep them with the program. So the example of Brazil under Lula versus Brazil in the decades preceding Lula is a perfect example, I think. It's like, at least he was trying to bring them in, and therefore you had a political consensus for hard stuff that needed to be done. So just as a last slide, the way I try to think about these issues and how that relates maybe to the ethical issues that you guys concern yourself with, I try to practice economics as a human science. This is in France, social sciences are called human sciences, not social. A science that has all of the trappings of science with experiments, rigor, etc. At the same time, a science of the human being with all of its complexities, which we've seen find their way into the ethical issue. A science that's human itself, that realizes how many mistakes we are doing all the time, realizing the possibility to get it wrong at so many levels, and that there's no way to not get it wrong and then try again. And that's also humane in the sense of being generous and being committed, and in a sense, that's the principles that maybe help us see the light through this type of difficult issues that I was just raising a moment ago. So let me stop here. And thank you very much. Yeah, I'm happy to take some questions.
Yeah, we'd like to have some questions. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so please come to the podium for Professor Duflo.
And you'll stop when it's 10 minutes.
Yes, I'll tell you. Go ahead, right at the front mic, please.
Thanks. I enjoyed your talk, and it's actually nice to see an economist at one of these things, because I'm an economist and also an IRB chair, and I do actually lab experiments. But one of the things that you mentioned as an ethical dilemma was this issue of randomization and the idea that a lot of people do kind of have this uncomfortable feeling about potentially withholding something that's potentially beneficial to one group versus another. And one of the things our IRB has struggled with, especially with more vulnerable populations, is this question. And a solution that we've employed sometimes is after the fact, if an intervention has proven to be beneficial, to then, after the research is completed, to provide it to the control group that didn't get it in the first place. Is that something that's been typically done in your stuff? And just interested in your thoughts on that.
So it's frequently the case. So it is frequently the case that the randomization on the field is based on phased-in program. So you're planning, like in the deworming experiment that I talked about, is you have 75 schools in the study, and they are going to be, they enter in trenches. And then, but in the meantime, if you found out that it doesn't work at all, then you don't scale it up to them. So it is frequently the case, I would say, maybe 2/3 of the cases that I've been involved with, where if things work out, they are scaled up in that population right away.
Thank you. The next question.
Hi, my name is Annie Snow. I'm with the University of Utah. I'm an IRB administrator there. But I'm also doing some graduate work on poverty alleviation in especially countries in Africa. So this was actually really intriguing. This topic was really intriguing for me. I'm wondering if you could maybe address some of the ethical issues that surround providing some of this aid to some of these groups, but then not having the financial backing to maybe continue the programs once they're found to be effective.
So that goes back to the previous questions. And here the question is, so typically you can at least have the plan to continue for some time if it turns out to be effective, and then maybe to scale up to the control. Secondly is typically the way experiments work in practice is that you have a very small program that wants to be evaluated. And the first thing that happens in the process of an experiment is you need to find a lot of money to implement it at a larger level. So typically the first thing that happens is not that you're withholding to some people, is that you're expanding way beyond what was planned. Both time-wise and geography-wise. Because the partners were planning to do these things for 6 months, and you realize you need at least 2 years, and the partner was planning to work in 20 places, and you really would like to work in 200. So typically, it's very rarely the case. I think it's never happened to me that I had to convince people to hold back on what they were doing. It's like you're always trying to work on the other margin of the expansion, which I think helps a little bit with that concern.
Thank you. Next question.
Ivor Pritchard, Office for Human Research Protections. I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit more about the responses of both your partners as you try to do these research studies and the reactions of policymakers in general to research findings. With respect to the first, when you want to do a study with a partner that's putting the program in place, how much of a problem is it that the program people want you to design the study in such a way as to perhaps demonstrate or inflate the success of the program? And secondly, when you're looking at a program, there is research that shows that policymakers presented with research findings sometimes say, well, the research must be wrong. And how do you take into account when you're doing a research study the likelihood that even when the research study is completed and you have a research finding, that the policymakers are going to ignore you anyway?
Those are both great questions. So with respect to the first one, so there are many people who run organizations who run programs in the world, and not all of them are willing to work with people like us. Some of them just are adverse to randomization. Some of them are sure that what they are doing is great, so it doesn't need to be evaluated. But the fact is there are so many of these guys around running so many programs that you can just work with the people who are willing to work with you with the rules of the games. And of course, in a lot of cases, they hope that you're going to show that what they do works, because after all, they believe in it, otherwise they wouldn't do it in the first place. But if they've agreed to work with us, with all of the constraints that it imposes on the way that the program is being run and the data collection and all that, like it's not really, it's a little bit heavy duty compared to the monitoring they might usually do. It's because they have a true, genuine curiosity in finding out. And therefore, so I never had ex post the problem of someone trying to suppress a finding or say, oh, I don't believe it, the people who were actually implementing. Now with the policymakers, I think you're entirely right that a piece of research is but one element in a very complex decision process, and I wish that element had a little bit more prominence than it sometimes has. Two things, randomization helps a huge deal, because even comparing to another valid research design that is complicated to explain, in a valid research design that's complicated to explain, someone can always find faults. When you present someone with a bar chart and saying, this is what happened under your program, this is what happened in the alternative, and really there is no difference, it's much harder. So people will still find ways, but it's much harder. Then they might say, well, this was just this one instance, but then the answer is repetition, replication, etc. In a lot of cases, policymakers in particular will be skeptical that some conclusion from somewhere applies to them as well. So they'll be, but then sometimes they will be willing to do the experiment in their own setting. And in this way, you slowly progress. One thing that I've found is much easier to convince people to adopt things that work than to discontinue things that don't work. And that's kind of what, we have a policy team that is in charge of disseminating results, and that's really something we're working on. And to be honest, I don't think research is ever going to be the only thing that people base policy decisions on, research and then social preferences. It's going to be always a part. But then our responsibility is to produce the good research and make it available and disseminate it as much as we can, and then progressively change the culture. And I think the culture is changing. In the last 15 years that I've been doing this work, I think the culture is changing, and there is much more openness now about both the process of research and learning within governments and accepting findings.
So we're almost out of time, but we have 3 people at the speaker.
I can take all 3.
Yeah. So if people could just say your question and then move on, and then she'll answer all at the end, because there may be some commonalities that she can join. So please be brief with your questions, and we'll have her answer those. And we will run over a little bit, but you have some time in between, so don't worry about that.
Hi. Ken Carson, Harvard Social Behavioral IRB member. And one thing you talked about in terms of program evaluation is that often the program is established, and you stated that it's going to happen anyway and you're just evaluating. I'd like to suggest and hear your experience. It seems more gray than that, that very often a researcher, particularly a prominent one like you, has leverage with the sponsor, so that, because from the IRB's perspective, it's take it or leave it, if, you know, and it seems like there's in fact more leverage that, you know, the IRB can ask you to go back and negotiate at least some elements.
Thank you. Please try and be brief as you can.
Melanie Dominich Rodriguez, a Utah State University IRB chair. I am wondering about the practical considerations in negotiating the international IRBs. Whatever you could share on that, I'd be really interested in.
Okay, and lastly?
Thanks. Steve Jaffe from the University of Pennsylvania. My question is, if in addition to the issues that you've raised, if you've encountered any of the research you've been involved with, situations where the sort of social, political, human rights context of the places in which you were working were such that they put pressures on the team to do things that the team were uncomfortable with, the research team, or if that in any way sort of created, if you have any situations of those sorts of political pressures from the context in which you were working, creating ethical challenges for the research that you wanted to do. In some cases, I suspect because the results of the research might actually challenge some of those social and political structures in the context of which you were working.
Thank you. So as far as the first question is concerned, you're absolutely right. There is a whole continuum between extreme control by the researcher and no control whatsoever. So as a member of an IRB, I think that researchers are not always entirely transparent about how much control they really have. And I take the point that sometimes they can be more give and take that we as researchers are willing to acknowledge. But it is sometimes the case that that's how it is. It's really, there is a whole spectrum, and it's good to be pretty explicit about what you can do. A good giveaway, if you have 25 treatments that are slightly varying the type of the program, is people have pretty good control. And on the other hand, if you have one big package of an evaluation that is run by the government, typically it's what you were handed. And I agree with the conclusion that you were implicitly drawing, that if the researchers are controlled, then it means the IRB has control as well, and therefore has oversight. And I think that's exactly the right way to think about it. On the question of international IRB, you probably know more than me, but generally that's a mess. And in some places, to be perfectly honest, IRBs are just rent-making opportunities for some institution or another that was given this job. And I think it's important that the IRBs here are aware of the constraint that the researchers are facing over there. In some cases, for example, in India, there is no IRB that is useful for anything but my biomedical research, but you can set IRBs up. And so what I have done is work with local institutions to set up IRBs that follow the Bellman principle. And it's quite feasible. So I think that's sort of the way to go, is to even create a little bit more competition between IRBs so that when it's possible, when it's not regulated by the government, so that it doesn't become just a way of extracting some rent from the research. It's important to have control and local control, but it's important not that it doesn't become just barriers to the research. On the last question on the social political constraint, I haven't had too much problems like that, but partly because I have made the choice in my own work to focus on contexts that are not too hard. And maybe some people maybe that's the wrong choice, because very hard political contexts we also need to be working there. But it causes so many issues, both at the ethical level and the practical level and at the safety level and integrity of the experiment, that I feel there is enough work to be done in contexts where you can work pretty well, that I've been focusing on those. So I don't have, but some people do work in those contexts, and I think it would be very interesting to speak to them to find out how they handle those pressures.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking you for a wonderful, wonderful talk.
Thank you very much.